Rex carried the small,
Pineapple.
prosthetic leg gently in his jaws, crossing the shelter yard as if he understood its weight. He stopped before little Emily, only 5 years old, and placed it softly in front of her. For a moment, the world went silent. Volunteers, Jack, everyone, they could hardly believe what they were seeing. Just days ago, Rex was feared, called dangerous, untamable. And yet here he was, not just playing, but reaching the heart of a child who had locked away her laughter since the accident that took her leg. Stories like this remind us that true strength often lies in compassion and in the second chances we dare to give. If this moment stirs something inside you, tell us where in the world you are watching from and share how it makes you feel. May your day be filled with kindness and quiet miracles. The morning in Riverdale broke with a muted chill, a pale sun rising through a veil of clouds that cast long shadows across the narrow streets of the small town. Jack Carter, 42 years old, a tall and muscular veteran with a field jacket worn from years of service, guided his battered pickup truck through the quiet roads. Beside him sat his 5-year-old daughter, Emily, her golden hair tied back loosely, her small frame balanced between the seat and the pair of crutches that leaned against the door. Since the accident that took one of her legs, laughter had become rare, her smiles fleeting like ghosts of a life once carefree. Jack's hope, heavy and unspoken, was that today might bring something back to her eyes, something that the war had taught him was priceless companionship that heals. The truck turned into the gravel lot of the Riverdale Animal Rescue Center, a shelter known in town for its rust-red brick walls and chain-link fences that rattled in the wind. Inside, the sound was immediate and overwhelming, dogs barking in overlapping pitches, metal doors clanging, the smell of disinfectant mixed with old straw. Volunteers moved between the kennels, carrying bowls of food, calling out greetings to one another. Jack, his face weathered but kind, lifted Emily from the seat and settled her gently onto her crutches before taking her small hand. Her blue eyes, wide and hesitant, scanned the rows of kennels, already searching for something unnamed. A cheerful volunteer greeted them at the entrance, a woman in her mid-30s with auburn hair pulled back under a faded cap, her green apron bearing the shelter's logo. Her name was Linda Hayes, and she spoke with the practiced warmth of someone who had long balanced optimism with the daily reality of abandoned animals. She explained that many of the dogs were gentle, waiting for families, eager to be loved. Emily nodded, her lips pressed tight, though her gaze did not linger on the playful retrievers or the beagles wagging at the gate. Instead, her attention kept flickering down a darker corridor that stretched toward the back of the building, where the light thinned and the air grew still. Jack tried to encourage her toward the friendlier dogs, crouching beside a cage where a spaniel licked his fingers through the bars, but Emily's focus refused to shift. She tilted her head slightly, as if listening for a sound beneath the noise of the kennel. Jack followed her eyes, and a faint shiver passed through him when he noticed the farthest pen wrapped in shadows. The metal bars were bent in one corner, scarred as though something inside had hurled itself against them. A sign marked in bold red letters read, "Danger. Do not approach." Jack's jaw tightened. He had seen warnings like that before, on cages overseas, on cells that held men broken by war. Before he could redirect Emily, a low growl rippled from the shadows, rolling like thunder through the concrete floor. Volunteers stiffened, exchanging quick, uneasy glances. From within the pen, a massive German shepherd emerged into the dim light. His coat was black streaked with gray, matted and rough from neglect. His amber eyes burned with a mix of defiance and pain. Scars traced across his muzzle, and as he paced, the muscles in his shoulders bunched and released like coiled steel. Foam clung to his jaws, his teeth flashing whenever he snapped at the bars. This was Rex, a 6-year-old K-9 once trained for military service, now written off by the staff as too dangerous to save. Linda's expression shifted, her practiced smile faltering as she saw Emily watching the dog. She lowered her voice, telling Jack about Rex's past. He had been found near the remains of a farmhouse fire on the edge of town, a charred chain fused around his neck, eyes wild with a terror no one could ease. In the weeks since, he had destroyed 3 kennels, lunged at handlers, ignored every treat or toy offered to him. He did not play, did not rest. He barked through the nights until the echo seeped into the walls. "We think he saw things no animal should," Linda murmured, her hand tightening on her clipboard. He's damaged. He can't be placed with a family. Jack listened, his chest heavy with the familiar ache of recognizing another soul marked by fire and loss. He had served with men who came home with the same look in their eyes, restless, haunted, unable to sleep through the silence. But when he turned to Emily, expecting her to recoil, he found her gaze steady, her small chin lifted. The little girl, who had retreated from the world since her accident, was now leaning slightly on her crutches, studying the German shepherd as though she saw not a beast, but something else hidden beneath the scars. Emily whispered softly, almost to herself, "He looks lonely." Jack crouched beside her, his voice tense, urging her to stay back, but she shook her head. The determination in her young face startled him. It was the same spark he had once carried into battle, the refusal to step away from something that mattered. Around them, volunteers shifted uneasily, some muttering that it was unsafe even to linger so close. One older man in uniformed overalls warned that the dog had already bitten a handler last week and might do worse if provoked. The growl inside the pen deepened, Rex's paws scraping against the floor as he tracked Emily's every movement. For a moment, it seemed he might hurl himself at the bars again, the sound of his breath harsh and ragged. Jack placed a steadying hand on his daughter's shoulder, ready to pull her back. Yet Emily did not flinch. She held Rex's gaze with a quiet intensity, her small body fragile yet anchored by something unspoken. The shelter seemed to hush around them, even the other dogs falling momentarily silent. Jack straightened, torn between fear and a strange recognition. He knew what the volunteers believed, that Rex was hopeless, condemned to isolation. But he also saw the flicker in Emily's eyes, the rare hint of life that had been missing since the day her leg was taken. For the first time in months, she was not retreating inward. She was reaching out, not with her hands, but with her heart. Against every instinct sharpened by war and fatherhood, Jack realized he could not simply tell her no. As the tension swelled, Linda stepped forward, her face pale. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice firm though her eyes betrayed worry. "That dog is off limits. He's not safe." She began to usher Emily away, but the little girl tightened her grip on her crutches and shook her head with surprising force. "I want to meet him," Emily declared, her voice small yet unwavering. Jack froze, the words striking through him like a blade. Around them, the volunteers exchanged anxious glances, disbelief etched across their faces. To them, it was madness, but to Emily, it was something else entirely. Jack looked down at his daughter, his throat thick, and for the first time he saw not just the child he longed to protect, but a spirit rising from the shadows of her loss. She was asking not for danger, but for connection. Something both she and Rex had been denied. He knew the risks, could picture the worst outcomes, but he also knew that denying her might extinguish the small flame he had just seen return. As silence pressed in, Jack's heart battled between fear and faith, torn by the decision that now stood before him. The air in the Riverdale shelter grew heavy as Jack realized there was no turning back from his daughter's quiet demand. Moments earlier, Emily had declared she wanted to meet the dog everyone feared, and now the volunteers reluctantly parted, creating a narrow passage that led toward Rex's pen at the far end of the corridor. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting uneven beams against the concrete walls, and each echo of their footsteps seemed to stretch too long, as if the building itself resisted what was about to happen. Jack's hand hovered near his daughter's shoulder, ready to pull her back at the first sign of danger, yet unable to ignore the determination written in her pale, fragile face. Emily leaned on her crutches, her steps uneven but steady, eyes locked ahead with a resolve that belied her small body. At the gate of the pen, Rex was already a storm of motion, pacing from one side to the other, his claws scraping against the floor, his body rippling with tension. His black and tan coat, once proud and gleaming, looked ragged in the artificial light, his scarred muzzle slick with foam as his breathing deepened into low, menacing growls. The sound vibrated through the corridor, forcing the volunteers to step back against the walls, one man clutching a tranquilizer gun close to his chest, his knuckles white with fear. Rex's amber eyes glared at the intruders, wild and burning, as though every memory of pain and betrayal lived in that single gaze. Jack's heart pounded as he watched the beast square its stance, muscles taut, ready to lunge at the smallest movement. Emily faltered for a moment, her hand tightening on the handle of her crutch as her knees wobbled, but she did not retreat. Her lips trembled before parting in a whisper so soft only those nearest could hear. "I've been afraid too," she murmured, her voice unsteady yet certain, carrying a weight far beyond her years. "I lost a part of myself too." The words floated into the air, fragile and unexpected, cutting through the growl like a thin shaft of light breaking through storm clouds. Jack's breath caught in his chest, stunned that his daughter would bear her deepest wound to a creature everyone else saw only as a monster. For a heartbeat, Rex seemed unaffected, his growl rumbling louder, echoing down the hallway until one of the volunteers muttered that they should end this before someone got hurt. But then something subtle shifted in the dog's eyes. The blazing fury dulled, flickering uncertainly as though caught between instinct and recognition. His pacing slowed, the rigid rhythm faltering, his ears twitching backward before pressing forward again. He inhaled sharply, nostrils flaring as he caught Emily's scent, and his massive frame trembled not from rage this time, but from hesitation. The sound of his growl thinned into silence, replaced by the heavy pant of an animal torn between worlds. Jack's body tensed, every muscle urging him to scoop up his daughter and retreat, yet his mind hesitated, struck by the sight unfolding before him. He had seen hardened soldiers soften when confronted with a fragment of themselves in another's pain, and now he watched a dog, broken by fire and chains, falter at the voice of a little girl who understood loss. Jack's pulse raced as fear clashed with awe. He wanted to protect Emily, yet he could not ignore the invisible thread beginning to weave itself between her and Rex. It was as if two wounded souls, bound by scars neither chose, recognized each other in the silence between breaths. Emily's small fingers gripped the wooden handle of her crutch as she leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving the dog's. Her voice steadied, clearer this time. "You're not angry. You're just hurt," she said gently, her words trembling yet direct, like a secret offered rather than a command. The volunteers held their breath, disbelief etched into their faces, unable to reconcile the image of a child speaking to the most feared animal in the shelter, as though he were nothing more than another lonely being. Jack's throat tightened, his vision blurring at the edges as he felt both terror and pride collide inside him. Rex stopped pacing. His body, once rigid as stone, lowered fractionally, the weight shifting from his front legs as he eased back. His tail, stiff and locked against the floor, flickered once, uncertain. His eyes, once blazing with fire, now shimmered with something rawer confusion, grief, and the faintest glimmer of yearning. He sat down heavily, his massive frame trembling, his head lowering a few inches as though bowing beneath the invisible burden he had carried for so long. The sound in the corridor changed, no longer filled with growls and scraping claws. It settled into an uneasy stillness, the fragile quiet of something impossible just beginning. Jack exhaled shakily, his hand pressed to his temple as though to steady the storm inside. He wanted to rush forward, to shield Emily, but he stood frozen, unable to tear himself from the sight. His daughter had done what no handler, no trainer, no soldier could achieve. She had stilled the fury inside Rex with nothing more than honesty and a trembling whisper. Around him, the volunteers looked on, their eyes wide, their mouths open in silent disbelief. One young woman, barely 20, clutched her clipboard to her chest, tears forming as she whispered, "He's listening." Jack's chest ached, his heart swelling with both fear and something close to hope. Emily allowed herself a small smile, the first Jack had seen in weeks, fragile yet radiant, as though coaxed into life by the trust taking root before her. She shifted her crutch, balancing herself carefully, and whispered once more, her words soft but filled with certainty. "You don't have to be scary," she told Rex. "You're just like me. You just need someone." The shepherd's ears flicked, his gaze locked on hers, and he let out a long sigh that rattled like the collapse of old defenses. His shoulders slumped, his head lowered further until it nearly brushed the floor, and in that single motion, the dangerous dog became something else entirely, a soul too tired to keep fighting. The silence stretched, thick with awe and disbelief, as Emily and Rex remained locked in a gaze that neither broke. Jack, his throat dry, finally allowed his hand to drop from his temple, though his eyes never left his daughter and the beast who now sat before her. Every instinct told him this was temporary, a fragile truce that could shatter in an instant, yet in his gut he felt something deeper stirring. For the first time, Rex had chosen not to attack, not to rage, but to sit, as though acknowledging the little girl who dared to see past his scars. And for the first time since her accident, Emily had chosen not to hide from the world, but to step toward it with courage. The volunteers slowly began to murmur among themselves, their voices hushed as though afraid to break the spell. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others wiped their eyes, but none dared to move closer. Jack stood rooted in place, torn between rushing to end this moment and letting it unfold. He realized with a start that he was holding his breath, and when he finally exhaled, it came with a trembling release. He understood, perhaps better than anyone in the room, that what had happened was more than chance. It was recognition, one wounded heart finding another. As Rex sat before Emily, silent for the first time since his arrival, Jack knew the world inside that shelter had shifted. The following week in Riverdale brought with it a softer light, mornings edged with mist that clung to the roofs and fields, as though the town itself held its breath in quiet expectation. Jack returned to the shelter with Emily by his side, her crutches tapping against the tiled floor of the hallway, echoing like a measured heartbeat. Volunteers, still uncertain after the astonishing moment they had witnessed days earlier, exchanged wary glances as the child approached the darkened pen once more. Rex waited inside, his eyes alert, his chest heaving, but no growl rumbled from his throat this time. Emily reached into her small backpack and produced a folded piece of paper, her drawing of a bright yellow sun hovering over a dog and a little girl, and slipped it carefully beneath the bars. Rex sniffed the page with suspicion, his muzzle brushing against the crayon lines, and for a tense moment, the volunteers braced themselves for the sound of tearing. Yet instead of shredding the fragile gift, the German shepherd lowered his body and pressed his nose to the paper, letting out a soft sigh. Emily's lips curved into a smile, brighter than any Jack had seen in months, and she tapped her crutch once in excitement. Jack's heart swelled as he watched the two souls, one scarred by war, the other by an accident that had stolen her laughter meet in that simple gesture. For the volunteers it was baffling, but for Jack, it was something close to sacred. The visits became routine. Each morning that Jack did not have to work at the auto shop, he drove Emily back to the shelter, and each time she carried with her another small token. Sometimes it was a stuffed animal with an ear missing, sometimes another drawing with bold colors that looked like hope captured on paper. Rex accepted each offering solemnly, never tearing, never discarding, but holding them as though they were treasures meant only for him. The staff began to murmur in disbelief, whispering to one another that the terrifying dog was changing, but only for her. Emily, meanwhile, began to laugh again, small bursts of sound that Jack carried home like trophies of victory. It was on one of these mornings that Jack reconnected with a figure from his past. Mason Briggs, a man in his early 50s with graying hair cut short and spectacles perched on a strong nose, arrived at the shelter carrying a worn leather bag of instruments. Once a medic in the same unit as Jack, Mason had left the service to study veterinary medicine, and now he worked as a veterinarian in the county. His tall frame carried a quiet gravity, his voice calm, precise, and edged with the patience of someone who had seen too much suffering and chose to fight against it in his own way. When Jack recognized him, the two men clasped hands with the tight grip of brothers reunited after long years apart. Jack explained what Emily had done, how Rex responded only to her, and Mason listened intently, his eyes flicking toward the cage where the shepherd lay, with a stuffed rabbit tucked gently between his paws. Mason's lips pressed into a thoughtful line, and he nodded. "Trauma," he murmured. "He's not just angry. He's carrying memories, same as some of us did." He offered to examine Rex, not physically at first, but through careful observation, watching how his ears tilted when Emily spoke, how his tail thumped faintly at her laugh. Mason told Jack and the staff that the process would be long, requiring both medical support and emotional connection, but he was willing to help if they were willing to try. Emily's bond with Rex grew deeper each day. She would sit cross-legged on the floor just beyond the bars, leaning her crutches beside her, and tell him about her world. She described her favorite storybooks, the friends she missed at school, the dreams she sometimes had about running without help. Rex listened in silence, his head tilted slightly, amber eyes fixed on her with a focus so intense it unnerved the volunteers. When she hummed a lullaby her mother used to sing, Rex would lower his body, stretching out on the concrete, and close his eyes as though the melody reached a place no voice had touched before. The volunteers struggled to reconcile what they were witnessing. Some argued it was dangerous to allow a child so close, insisting that any slip could bring disaster. Others, softer in their doubt, admitted they had never seen Rex so calm, so willing to sit without lunging at the bars. The shelter manager, a stern woman in her 40s named Margaret, shook her head in disbelief. "It's like he only understands her," she whispered during one of the meetings. Jack stood silently nearby, knowing that disbelief was the beginning of acceptance, and acceptance was the first step toward hope. Mason continued to visit, bringing with him gentle techniques he had used on other traumatized animals. He would speak in low tones, avoid direct eye contact, and encourage Emily to extend her hand slowly, always letting Rex choose the distance. Rex responded with caution at first, his body rigid, his ears pinned, but with Emily's presence, he began to soften. Mason explained that the girl's vulnerability, the crutches, her quiet honesty gave Rex a mirror, something he recognized from his own suffering. "He sees her pain and knows she won't hurt him," Mason said one evening, as Jack sat with him outside the shelter. "That's why he trusts her." And sometimes, trust is the hardest medicine of all. As the weeks passed, the transformation grew undeniable. Emily's laughter filled the halls more often, her cheeks flushed with color instead of pale sorrow, and Rex's cage no longer echoed with frantic howls at night. Instead, volunteers reported finding him lying beside her drawings, nose pressed gently against the paper as though guarding them while he slept. The sight spread through the staff like quiet wildfire, breaking down walls of skepticism and fear. Even the man with the tranquilizer gun admitted one morning that perhaps, against all odds, the dog was learning to be something more than a prisoner of his rage. One afternoon, Emily brought a plush bear missing one arm, clutching it tightly before pushing it through the gap beneath the bars. Jack and the volunteers waited tensely, expecting it to be ripped apart in seconds. Instead, Rex took it carefully between his teeth, turned once, and carried it to the corner of his pen. There he lay down, placing the bear between his paws, and lowered his head on top of it as though it were a child's pillow. A murmur swept through the volunteers, some covering their mouths with their hands, tears welling in their eyes. Jack looked down at Emily, who was smiling so widely her dimples returned for the first time in months, and he knew something irreversible had begun. That evening, when the last volunteer locked up and the sun dipped behind the hills of Riverdale, Jack and Mason lingered outside. The air was cool, filled with the scent of damp grass, and the sound of crickets rose around them. Mason clapped a hand on Jack's shoulder and said, "Your girl is saving him, but don't forget, he's saving her too." Jack's throat tightened as he nodded, watching Emily climb into the truck, her crutches balanced across her lap, still clutching the empty backpack that once carried a gift now treasured by Rex. In the fading light, Jack knew that the dog, once considered untamable, had already begun to change, and that change carried both risk and promise, but above all, it carried hope. The morning sun filtered weakly through the shelter's barred windows, laying streaks of light across the concrete floor that seemed more like prison than refuge. After weeks of visits, whispers, and quiet miracles, the staff had finally agreed to a supervised trial, an extraordinary decision that would allow Emily to step inside Rex's kennel. The air was thick with tension as volunteers gathered along the corridor, some with hope in their eyes, others clinging to doubt. Jack stood tall, his olive green jacket zipped against the chill, one hand resting protectively on his daughter's shoulder as she leaned on her crutches, her small frame taut with both fear and anticipation. At the far end, Rex sat, ears pricked, body rigid, amber eyes following their every move. The lock clicked open with a sound that made hearts skip, the heavy gate creaking on rusty hinges as though reluctant to yield. Emily's breath caught, her knuckles whitening around the handles of her crutches, yet she did not hesitate. She stepped forward slowly, one uneven stride after another, the echo of her progress filling the hushed corridor. Volunteers pressed themselves back against the walls, some whispering prayers, others clutching clipboards like shields. Jack's chest tightened as though he were back on the battlefield, watching a comrade walk into danger, powerless to intervene. Every sound, from the clatter of a metal bowl to the scrape of Rex's claws, rang like thunder in the silence. Rex rose to his feet, his massive frame quivering as though coiled to spring. His lips parted, revealing a flash of teeth, and a growl rumbled deep in his chest, vibrating through the bars and into the bones of everyone watching. Emily froze for the briefest moment, her breath quickening, yet her eyes never left his. She whispered softly, almost like a secret only he could hear, "It's okay. I'm here. Okay. I'm—" The growl faltered, flickering uncertainly, before trailing into a heavy sigh. With each step she took, Rex's muscles tightened, then slowly eased, caught between instinct and recognition. Then came the moment that silenced even the most skeptical hearts. Rex lowered his head, the fire in his amber eyes dimming into something raw, more fragile, and stepped forward one deliberate pace at a time. Emily stood still, her crutches steadying her, her hands trembling at her sides. The dog stopped before her, towering over her small frame, his breath hot against her skin. Instead of snapping or lunging, he bowed, pressing his scarred head gently into her lap. The corridor filled with the sound of muffled sobs as volunteers covered their mouths, unable to believe the transformation unfolding before them. Jack felt his knees weaken, his vision blur, as the weight of weeks of fear dissolved into wonder. Tears streamed down Emily's cheeks as she buried her small hands into Rex's rough fur, her shoulders shaking with laughter and relief. Rex leaned into her touch with a shudder, his tail giving the faintest thump against the floor. A woman near the back of the crowd whispered, "It's a miracle." And others nodded, their doubt replaced by awe. Jack, for the first time since the accident, saw his daughter radiant again, her smile wide and unguarded, her spirit shining like a light through the cracks of her sorrow. He pressed a trembling hand over his chest, whispering to himself, "Thank you," though he wasn't sure if the words were meant for Rex, for Emily, or for something greater. Yet not all hearts were moved in the same direction. Later that afternoon, in the staff meeting room lined with dusty binders and faded photographs of past adoptions, a heated discussion erupted. Several volunteers, led by a stern man named Richard Owens, late 40s, stocky build, close-cropped hair, his uniform shirt straining at the buttons, argued that Rex remained too great a risk. Richard's voice boomed across the table, insisting that one moment of calm could not erase weeks of violence. Others nodded, fearful that allowing the dog further chances might end in tragedy. The word "dangerous" echoed again and again, as though the label could not be peeled away. Jack rose from his seat, his jaw tight, his voice steady but charged with conviction. He spoke not only as a father, but as a man who had seen broken soldiers learn to live again. He recounted Rex's changes, Emily's laughter, the nights when the dog no longer howled but instead lay silently beside her drawings. He turned to Mason Briggs, seated beside him in his neatly pressed checkered shirt, spectacles glinting in the fluorescent light. Mason, his calm authority carrying the weight of science and compassion, laid out his observations, pointing to Rex's lowered aggression, his responsiveness to Emily's voice, his willingness to accept comfort where once there had been only fury. "This is not chance," Mason said firmly. "This is progress, earned through patience, consistency, and love." Richard scoffed, his arms folded, but the words seemed to ripple through the room, softening the edges of resistance. One younger volunteer, eyes still red from tears shed in the corridor, whispered, "He chose her." "I saw it." Another admitted they had never believed change was possible until they saw Rex rest his head in Emily's lap. The arguments dwindled, the fire of fear fading into quiet reflection. Margaret, the shelter manager, leaned forward, her eyes weary yet glistening, and finally spoke with measured resolve. "We cannot ignore what we've seen. We'll allow Rex a supervised trial outside this kennel with Emily and Jack. If he continues to show this change, then perhaps he deserves what we thought impossible, a second chance." The decision was met with a wave of murmurs, some relieved, others hesitant, but none willing to oppose the truth any longer. Jack exhaled, his shoulders easing as he reached for Emily's hand, squeezing it gently. She looked up at him with wide, shining eyes, whispering, "He's ready, Dad." Rex, still lying calmly within the pen, lifted his head as though he sensed the shift, his ears tilting forward, his gaze steady and waiting. Mason closed his notebook with a quiet nod, satisfied that his faith had not been misplaced. As the evening light spilled gold across the shelter walls, the staff gathered one last time at Rex's cage. The gate was opened fully, the heavy bars swinging wide, no longer a barrier, but an invitation. Emily stepped forward on her crutches, Jack's steady hand hovering close, and Rex rose, stretching his frame before padding slowly toward her. He pressed his side gently against her leg, his body trembling not with rage but with release. Volunteers gasped, some covering their mouths, others simply staring as tears ran unchecked. In that moment, the decision was no longer words on a page or arguments in a meeting. It was written in the posture of a broken dog who had chosen to trust again, and in the smile of a little girl who had chosen to love without fear. The day Rex left the shelter carried the weight of history, a chapter closing on concrete floors and iron bars, and another opening beneath the quiet roof of Jack Carter's small house on the edge of Riverdale. The drive back was silent, except for the steady hum of the engine. Emily nestled in the back seat with her crutches leaning against the door, her wide eyes fixed on the German shepherd who lay curled beside her. Rex shifted occasionally, his amber gaze flicking toward her, as if uncertain whether freedom was real, and Emily would stroke his coarse fur with her small fingers, whispering reassurances only he seemed to hear. Jack, at the wheel, caught sight of them in the mirror, his chest tightening at the sight of two lives bound together by scars and by something even stronger, hope. At home, Rex explored cautiously, padding through the modest living room where old photographs lined the shelves, and the faint scent of motor oil lingered from Jack's days at the auto shop. He sniffed every corner, his ears twitching at the creak of the floorboards, his tail flicking uncertainly. Emily trailed behind him, balancing on her crutches, her laughter echoing against the walls that had been too quiet for too long. Jack watched from the doorway, arms folded, his weathered face softening as he realized the house was beginning to feel alive again. For years, war had hollowed him, loss had silenced Emily, but now the sound of her giggle chasing a once-feared dog filled every empty space. Night brought a different kind of healing. When Emily retired to her bedroom, Rex lay outside her door, stretched across the floor like a sentry on duty. His ears flicked at every creak, his body tense whenever the wind rattled the windows. Yet when Emily whimpered in her sleep, Rex nudged the door open with his nose and pressed his head against her small hand until her breathing steadied. Jack, standing in the hallway, witnessed this ritual more than once, his throat thick with emotion. He knew nightmares well, the kind that pulled soldiers back into fire and chaos. But here was a dog chasing them away for a child who had already suffered too much. Daylight transformed Rex into Emily's constant guardian. When she moved in her wheelchair, he padded beside it, his stride matched to the turning wheels, his body forming a shield between her and the world. When she used her crutches to hobble along the cracked sidewalk, Rex walked shoulder to shoulder, his steady presence giving her rhythm and confidence. Neighbors who had heard whispers of the dangerous dog now stopped at their fences, stunned by the sight before them. A little girl missing one leg and a scarred shepherd once condemned to death moved together as if they had been born a pair. Some neighbors wiped their eyes, others smiled through tears, and a few whispered prayers of gratitude for having witnessed something so pure. Jack, too, found himself changing in quiet ways he had not expected. For years after returning from war, trust had been foreign to him, and opening his heart felt like exposing a wound that might never close. But each time he saw Rex lower his head into Emily's lap, each time he heard his daughter's laughter fill the air, something inside him loosened. He began to join them more often, teaching Emily how to toss a ball for Rex, guiding her in gentle commands that the shepherd obeyed only when she gave them. Jack discovered that in helping his daughter heal, he was also remembering how to live again, one smile, one laugh, one fragile step at a time. Evenings became rituals of their own. Emily would sit on the porch, sketchbook balanced on her lap, crayons scattered around her as she drew Rex in bold colors, always larger than life, always smiling. Rex lay at her feet, his tail swishing lazily whenever she giggled at her own drawings. Jack often sat on the porch swing, watching the two of them, his hands clasped loosely in his lap, his silver dog tag necklace catching the fading sunlight. Neighbors passing by would pause, sometimes waving, sometimes lingering just long enough to let the scene etch itself into memory. A veteran, his daughter, and the dog who had turned tragedy into a story of healing. But the truest testament to their bond came on an afternoon when Jack decided to bring Emily and Rex back to the shelter, not out of necessity but out of gratitude. The volunteers gathered as word spread, their eyes following the trio as they stepped into the yard where so many battles had been fought weeks before. Emily, laughing as she played with Rex, leaned too far on her crutch, and in the chaos of movement, her prosthetic leg slipped loose, falling into the grass unnoticed. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Emily froze, uncertain, until Rex darted forward. With the same solemn care he had once given to her drawings and stuffed animals, he picked up the prosthetic in his jaws and trotted back, placing it gently before her. The yard fell silent. Every volunteer, every neighbor, every passerby struck motionless by the sight. Jack felt his breath catch, his eyes burning as he saw his daughter's face light with joy, her hand resting on Rex's head in gratitude. To those who had once called him dangerous, it was a revelation. To Jack and Emily, it was confirmation of what they had known all along, that love had not only tamed the fury inside Rex but had given him purpose again. Emily bent low, her small voice carrying across the yard, whispering, "Thank you." And Rex pressed closer, his body trembling not with fear, but with devotion. The volunteers could no longer deny what stood before them. Margaret, the shelter manager, wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, whispering, "He was never dangerous. He was just waiting for her." Mason Briggs, watching from the crowd, adjusted his spectacles, pride and relief etched into the lines of his face. For him, this was more than success. It was proof that wounds, no matter how deep, could mend when trust was allowed to grow. Jack nodded at him from across the yard, a silent exchange of gratitude that words could never hold. As the sun dipped behind the Riverdale hills, painting the sky in strokes of gold and crimson, Jack, Emily, and Rex stood together in the center of the yard. The crowd parted around them, some clapping softly, others simply crying, their hearts stirred by the image of a family forged not by blood alone, but by shared pain and chosen love. Jack placed his hand on Emily's shoulder, Rex leaning against her side, and for the first time in years, he felt not like a soldier or a broken man, but like a father who had finally found home. The story closed, not with triumph shouted, but with trust whispered, the image of one little girl, one scarred dog, and one weary veteran walking forward together, unbroken. This story reminds us that true strength is not found in power or fear, but in compassion, patience, and the courage to open our hearts again. A scarred dog once called dangerous, a child who had lost part of herself, and a father weighed down by war all found healing when love was stronger than fear. The lesson is clear. No soul is too broken to be mended when it is met with kindness and trust. If this story has touched you, share it with others, leave a comment with what you are thinking right now, and do not forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories of hope and healing. May God bless you and your loved ones, and may kindness guide your steps each day.